Hello and welcome to Business Connections, a program put on by the Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce. I'm Holly Allen, Director of Marketing and Communications for the Dayton Area Chamber. Welcome to 2017. We are starting a new year and businesses in our region are making their plans to be successful this year. And this is one of the shows we do every year, every January, and this is one of my favorite shows that we do. Every year we bring in an expert to sit down and talk about what we could maybe expect for the coming year as far as our economy goes. And so my lucky candidate today is Dr. Tom Traynor from Wright State University. And Dr. Traynor, thank you for being with us. I know it's hard to put you in the hot seat, and this isn't an easy spot to be.
Well, that's okay. You're very welcome. I enjoy doing this.
You've been my victim the last couple of years, so I appreciate it. Thank you for doing that. We sit down every year. I think it's been the last 3 years at least. You and I, we've sat down and taken a look at the past year a little bit as far as our regional economy goes, and then also talked about some predictions for the coming year. So kind of hold your feet to the fire and take a look back every year at what you said the previous year. I want to start with 2016 and some of the predictions you made. Can you give us a little wrap up of how we ended 2016?
Sure. It was another good year for the region. The Dayton metropolitan area continued to have as strong job growth as it's had since the late 1990s. Added another roughly 7,000 jobs. The final figures aren't quite in yet, but it looks like we'll end up about 7,000 employees above last year. That's a 1.8% increase.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, that really is very good. It's actually a little bit above the national increase for last year in total employment. And Dayton is either going to come out the leader or about tied for the lead among all the metro areas in Ohio. So even though it was about the same as the year before, a lot of other metropolitan areas, they grew, but not quite as fast as Dayton did. So Dayton had an excellent year, in my opinion, for 2016. Income growth was also good, and income growth last year, or at least 2015 is really the last year we really have a full set of data for, started rising even for middle income families at a greater rate than had been the case earlier in the recovery and the expansion that we're in now. So that was good news. Not that it's benefiting everyone, but median household income grew by over 5%. Average per capita income, mean income, grew by over 3% last year for the region. And again, when I say last year, I mean 2015. And early indications are we're going to have another year similar to that once the final estimates are completed for 2016. And that makes sense for a variety of reasons, not just the early income data, but tax revenues are up locally at the local level in the region. And it just seems that the job market is favoring workers a little bit more than before. So I think, all in all, 2016 turned out to be a good year, probably the best year we've had again since before 2000.
Excellent. Did any of that surprise you? And keep in mind, I went back and watched last year's show, so I remember what you said.
Not too much. I think the one surprise was that there was a little bit of a decline in the growth rates in some of our, what I consider similar metro areas. And despite that, we were able to maintain growth. So I was expecting continued steady growth, and that's what we got. And so that wasn't a big surprise. The one industry that turned out to be a big surprise to me was the hospitality and leisure industry. You tend to expect some growth there as the economy expands. It's sort of a luxury good, people going to the movies, eating out, all that sort of activity. But job growth there actually accelerated last year, grew by about 5%.
Really?
Which that caught me off guard. So that was sort of a surprise. I guess it's a good surprise. But that was one industry I was expecting more moderate growth in. So that was it for the surprises for me.
Well, then that's pretty good. I would say that's a pretty good track record. I do remember you said quite a bit last year the phrase steady growth. Which I think pretty much summed it up, maybe a little better than you expected. We always start with the unemployment numbers. I think a lot of people start there, and every year you caution me when we look at those numbers. But the unemployment numbers for 2016, we saw a little bit of an uptick and then maybe a little bit back down as we headed toward the end of the year. Can you kind of translate that and what you think that means?
Sure. Yeah. The main thing I want to caution people about is looking at a single month's unemployment rate and drawing too much from that. So on a regional level, the Department of Labor really uses a relatively small sample. Their main goal is to get a pretty accurate unemployment rate nationally. So they don't use a lot of data regionally, and they try to tie a regional employment number to the statewide unemployment number. So it's a little bit skewed by what's happening statewide, and it can be a little bit skewed by the small samples from month to month. The main thing with regard to unemployment is that it is on a general downward trend. So the unemployment rate has been falling if you sort of follow it year over year more than month to month. And so the uptick in the middle of the year was really due to a sort of an unexpected uptick in the size of the labor force, the number of people actually coming back in the labor force looking for jobs.
So those who had maybe removed themselves, they weren't looking for a job,
Exactly. So there was an uptick that wasn't explained by just the number of new people graduating from high school or college. It was really just sort of an unusually big increase. And I do think that was an outcome of sort of the strong job growth and income growth we've had the previous couple of years. So I think that's a common piece of or a common event to see as you have an extended recovery, and we are seeing some people entering the workforce now that opportunities are just better. And so the unemployment rate's the number of unemployed divided by the labor force. Well, if that labor force grows faster than you're adding employment or reducing unemployment, then you're going to get the unemployment rate maybe going the wrong way or in a direction you didn't expect. But
Makes sense.
But ultimately, the labor market's improving for workers, and so that's why you don't want to pay too much of attention to a 3-month sort of blip or increase in the unemployment rate.
Right. Sounds to me like, if that's what's behind it, it's a good sign. Your workforce, some of those who had been kind of disenfranchised have gained some hope that there are opportunities available for them.
Yeah, so the region's added about 20,000 jobs in the last 2.5 to 3 years, and so that's sort of the bottom line, I think. And so I encourage people to try to follow the employment levels and the income levels, and that gives us a better sense of where the economy is really going.
Okay, good to know. And we did end, though, last we saw 4.2%, right?
Yes, that's a good number. That's a very low unemployment rate. Again, that might be a temporary downtick due to bad sampling, but ultimately it's the long-term trend is downwards. It's definitely under 5%, so the labor market conditions are good.
Good to know. Okay, so I know you know this question's coming because it's what everyone's talking about as we look to the economy for 2017. A few world issues have gone on, and of course we're having a change in federal leadership here in the U.S., and that could have a big effect, I assume, on our economy. What kind of effect do you think we could see going into 2017 as Donald Trump takes over as president?
Well, it's hard to say. To some degree, that we're having a change in leadership from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And some of what will happen will be sort of standard in terms of what you might expect in terms of the switch in parties in the White House. And there's always a certain amount of uncertainty because new presidents always bring in their new agendas, and you're not sure what they're going to be able to get through Congress. They actually have more limits on what they can do through executive action than you might be reading about right now. But ultimately, I would say there's a little bit more uncertainty than typically is the case. And so we can hear one thing from the president-elect one week and then something quite different the next week regarding, say, employment policy or international trade. And it's kind of different. And then spokespeople or different administrators that he's trying to bring into work in Washington with him have some differences of opinion historically. So I think it's a little bit difficult right now, and I would just sort of encourage people to sort of wait and see what policies really occur. So beyond sort of the typical underlying shift from the Democratic Party in the White House to the Republican Party in the White House, I think we have to kind of sit and wait a little longer, even though people might not want to. They're going to have to. One thing I would like to mention too is there's always a lag. So it takes a while for policies to be decided and then implemented, and then for economic actors like businesses and the population to react to those changes. So, really, even if things could change in the next few weeks in Washington, they won't filter through to the rest of the economy much before the end of this year. Okay,
so we may be looking more at 2018 for some of those, if we are going to see major changes.
Yeah, I think at least until the last probably 4 months of the year.
Okay. One thing that we've seen a lot of talk about it, President-elect Trump has vowed to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which many media outlets call Obamacare. Here in the Dayton region, that we've seen some really good growth in the healthcare industry. If some degree of a repeal takes place, how do you think that could affect some of our big employers here in the region?
Yeah, so I want to sort of divide that into two industries. One is the healthcare industry, so healthcare workers at hospitals, doctors' offices, physicians' offices, testing centers, versus the health insurance industry in the region. As it turns out, since the Affordable Care Act was instituted, the rate of growth in healthcare employment hasn't really changed much. So it's grown, you're right, but the rate of growth didn't really change. We haven't had a big uptick in the number of workers that you would expect to see compared to other recoveries and expansions that we've had in the past. So there's an element to which healthcare employment's been growing for several decades anyway, just as the quality of care has improved. And more recently, in the last 10 years or so, the population over the age of 50 has really grown a lot.
You have the baby boomers coming through.
That's right. And I'm at sort of the peak of the baby boom. And so there's an element to which, as we age, there's just increased demand for health care. And so there just hasn't been a real change. So we just finished our third year of the Affordable Care Act actually being in place. Over those 3 years, we just saw the same steady growth in healthcare employment that we had before. That'd be one area where I have to admit I was expecting a little bit more growth than we did. So we did have some accelerated growth, but again, it was kind of what you'd see from sort of economic expansion anyway. So to me, I'm not seeing a big ACA-related shift. Insurance, though, and in particular Caresource, which is a major insurer and particularly working with state governments, and the Medicaid expansion really created a big boost for them, they may be affected somewhat more. And it's hard to say. One important factor is that if people, it's just too early to say how the Affordable Care Act is going to be changed. Changes are going to have to go through Congress. It isn't something that the president can just nix or alter. And I don't think the president-elect is interested in creating a situation it's clearly abandoning tens of millions of people. So we'll see. I mean, I may be proven wrong there, but ultimately. There's always been this sort of push to repeal and replace. We'll see how that fans out. Some people just want to repeal and not replace. Others want to replace with something not too different. Some people want something radically different. So we'll just have to see how that is borne out. But a company like Caresource or other insurers, if policies change a lot, in other words, what's covered, but the number of people who are covered and they're still insured doesn't change. So the number of people insured doesn't change. There's still going to be a big role for insurance companies, including Caresource. If states still have a big role to play with Medicaid, or they're pleased with the services provided by a company like Caresource, even if there's a big rollback, they might find that they still have a lot of the same clients that they had. So I think Caresource in particular is a company we want to watch. I think they're watching things very carefully. They're not going to completely be on the sidelines. They're going to join together with other insurers to try to be heard in this process. So I think it'll be interesting to see going forward what happens, but because I think there's a lot of possibilities, but I'm not sure the healthcare industry is going to be impacted that negatively, even if it's rolled back a lot, just because there wasn't a big increase beyond the sort of increase we'd expect to see anyway there.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. Caresource, it seems, is kind of in the wait and see. They're obviously watching it very closely, but I did want to point out that they had made an announcement before all of this happened that they'd be expanding downtown. They'd be building a new building on First Street. They were going to house 900 employees there. So right after the election, Dayton Daily News reported that Caresource decided that they would continue with their plans. So nothing too drastic happening with Caresource just yet. So I
That's
think you're
right. Yeah, I think they can continue with those plans, and I think if they have to, they can make changes as the time comes. I don't think they're too far down the road on those plans yet.
Right, right. At the start of 2016, I asked you to name some industries that you thought would have an effect on the economy that year. And some of them you mentioned, healthcare, which we've talked about, transportation, warehousing and wholesale, logistics and supply chain management. And you also mentioned that you were pretty hopeful for professional and technical services as well. Looking back, did they follow through in 2016?
By and large, yeah. So the healthcare industry continued to experience growth. Actually, if you were to look at healthcare employment over a long period of time, you see this very steady increase, and it just continued last year.
Okay.
And so they came through just like they always do with a steady increase in employment, and those are generally pretty good paying jobs, and so that's good. And it provides some income into this area beyond that which you'd expect just from serving the area. So this region, Children's Hospital, Miami Valley Hospital, Kettering, and the networks associated with those hospitals, serve a population, pretty much halfway up to Toledo, and then a fair amount of the way over to Indianapolis. So we do bring in a fair number of patients for higher level care than just those who live in the immediate 3 to 4 to 5 county area, and so that's good for the area, for the region. Transportation, warehousing, wholesale, logistics, supply chain, all that continued to grow, not quite as much as the previous year. I was expecting growth similar to the previous year,
Okay.
but it came in a little short of that, but it is continuing to grow. It was mainly wholesale trade that flattened. It didn't decline, but it didn't have any increase. I had expected continued increase there. Not sure why. I haven't been able to in digging down further, I haven't been successful at figuring out why that was the case, but transportation continues to grow, warehousing continues to grow, logistics continues to grow, which is also related to that. And I'm expecting continued growth there next year.
Okay.
And then finally, the professional technical services is an industry that, to my mind, underperformed in the 2000s. It's continuing to grow. I'm very happy about that.
Yeah.
I think that's an industry that's important to the national economy and so many other regions, and it wasn't growing here, but now we're seeing some sustained growth for 2 to 3 years there. Very happy to see that. So this is business to business services, particularly on the side of technical services, computer science, software solutions. Those kinds of companies seem to be growing and adding jobs in this region. So that was excellent news.
It is good news. Are there any, are you talking about the same list of industries when you look at 2017?
Well, I would start with the same list, and I'm going to be watching leisure and hospitality. I'm not sure if it'll continue growing at the same rate as before. Again, leisure and hospitality's growth is a sign that conditions are improving here, because again, they're providing non-necessities, eating out, going golfing or
Right.
bowling or whatever, those kinds of activities, or going to the movies, are things people can do with extra dollars to entertain themselves. So most of the growth there is in that sort of entertainment activities rather than hotels.
Okay.
And I'm really pleased with that growth. Because it indicates that our economic growth in the region is sustained and good. But I'm expecting continued growth there. I don't see it just falling off a cliff next year. So it might
Right.
not grow quite as fast as this year, but I see continued growth there. A couple industries that I want to watch, I'm just going to sort of put out there, are manufacturing. It's been pretty flat, but that's better than the long-term decline that industry is going through in terms of employment.
Right.
The main thing hitting manufacturing, and this is important to point out because of all the sort of news stories about it, yes, some manufacturing jobs have been lost to other countries, but by and large, most manufacturing jobs have really been lost to machinery, robotics, and equipment like that.
Right.
Manufacturing is kind of going through the process that farming or agriculture did, 100 years ago to 25 years ago. And so we're manufacturing, almost as many goods, and the value of those goods has fallen maybe only, 15, 20% over the last 15 years in this region. But the employment used to make that has fallen by half.
Right. Wow.
And so we do like to see, Fuyao and other manufacturers be able to grow because it helps offset the efficiency gains that are causing layoffs or at least
Right.
reductions in force in those industries. And then insurance. What is going to happen with the Affordable Care Act? Will it affect one of our fastest growing companies, Caresource? That'll be interesting to see.
I do want to ask you before we go about our largest employer, of course, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It has an impact on our region, an economic impact of nearly $4.5 billion. So it's pretty big, as we know. But the linchpin here is that it relies on our federal government for some funding. And so last year you mentioned 2017 would be the year to watch when we're looking at changes in presidential leadership and what that means for the budget. Can you tell us what we might expect in 2017 here?
Yeah, so I don't think there'll be a big change in employment at the base, but I do think that the federal government has been kicking down the road the need to improve its infrastructure, which a lot of people know as BRAC, or the Base Realignment Commission. And so I don't know if they'll use BRAC again, or if the Department of Defense will want to use some other process. But I think, last year there was just a lot of effort to push it till after the national election. Well, the national election is passed, so that's going to come up. In terms of the administration, good question. We've had promises of stronger defense. We've had accusations of overspending coming from President-elect Trump. So it's hard to say exactly what will come out of the White House. Typically, Republican administrations tend to want to increase defense spending. So just putting that information out there. I don't know if this administration is going to do that or not. But I do think that the main thing that this region wants to pay attention to is realignment. Whether, as the government looks at its infrastructure and trying to stop doing activities all over the country that might be more efficiently done at centrally located places. This region's political officials, its economic development officials, and local and state development officials need to sort of start lining themselves up to position Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as a good place to relocate activities to. It's a big base. There are several important commands there. On the ground we have some advantages compared to a lot of other bases. But we certainly can't sort of rest and expect that those will be just sort of fall into place. So it will be important for regional development officials to pay attention to that and start really watching what's going on in Washington.
Yeah, I know that's something we at the Chamber work on, and that's a pretty big priority for us to make sure that we come out on top with those different changes. My final question for you is how all of this funnels down to the consumer. We talk about leisure and hospitality. To me, that's a big indicator that there are some extra spending dollars in our households and, family budgets. But what does all this mean to the everyday consumer?
Yeah, so there's two things going on here. It's nice to have economic growth where incomes are rising faster than inflation on average, which they are, and to be adding jobs, which those aren't completely unrelated. As more and more people are hired and the demand for labor grows, it tends to push up pay. So that's all good news, and it does help most consumers. It isn't necessarily helping all consumers. I think people still at the very low end of the skill set are not experiencing much in the way of pay increases that I think was a factor in this last election. I think it's a very tricky or difficult sort of problem to resolve. But overall, conditions are improving, and I think it does help many more households than it used to help. And so the number of households, or the proportion of households in the region that are experiencing improvements in their situation is growing. It isn't universal, it's not everybody in the area, but it is an increasing number of people in the region. So that's all good news. The other factor here is the length at which we've had this expansion. And for the region, it really sort of started about 3.5 years ago. So even though we had some job growth in the early years of the recovery, the expansion now is very beneficial, partly because of how long it's lasted. It's a little bit like compound interest. If you put money in a savings account, the following year and the third year and the fourth year's interest earnings are not just based on the initial deposit, it's based on your previous earnings. And that's kind of happening to the economy, that we have successive years of economic growth, it tends to have these sort of greater beneficial impacts on the region. And so we're starting to see housing prices rise. We're starting to see, as you said, hospitality and leisure activities increase. And so there are fewer people in financial difficulty. There are greater numbers of people who have some extra money to spend. Hopefully they're saving. Hopefully they're investing in their own, in economics use the term human capital, but improving their skill set. We want to see, I think one thing that's going to be helpful for people is if they achieve higher levels of education if they can. And that's very beneficial to them, and so I would encourage that. And having some extra income or some income can help them or help their children or family members accomplish that. So these are all ways in which the typical family is being helped. And so again, I don't want to diminish the problems faced by sort of the bottom fourth of the population. I don't think that things have improved much for that group. And we'd certainly like that, the situation to improve for those workers. And their pay has remained relatively low. Hopefully as the expansion continues, if we can have it continue, it'll eventually filter down it'll filter to more and more of the population, I guess I should say.
Very good points and good predictions, as always, Dr. Traynor. Thank you for being with me today. I'm sorry we're running out of time here, but I did want to mention before we go that the Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce puts together with Wright State University some economic information. They're called the Economic Indicators every month, and that's sent out to our members, but you can also access it at daytonchamber.org. So you want to check that out. Also, you can check us out on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook anytime. Thanks so much for being with us. Stay tuned for a message from our President and CEO, Phil Parker.
Today's annual show is always an interesting one because employers and citizens alike want to know as much as they can about our economy, especially our local economy, and the forecast for job growth and how the stock market may affect us. The Chamber's Research Advisory Council meets and reflects upon the many factors that affect our local economy, and it seems to be a mixed bag. Yes, we continue to see logistics area growth, as does healthcare and services, but there are also sectors that are not growing fast enough. The recent uptick in interest rates and oil prices will definitely affect the growth of manufacturing and other industries. Though we've seen the stock market run up some in November and December, that may not continue if we don't solve some of our other monetary and fiscal policy contradictions in 2017. Our Advisory Council has a sense of optimism for 2017 and believes 2017 will have positive growth, but only at about 2% or less for the year. Certainly not the robust prediction we were hoping for, but nevertheless positive and an indication we will continue to grow slightly in 17 unless the change in our nation's administration does something new to jolt us into a stronger economy that might trickle down to Ohio and our region. 2017 will be a very interesting year for all of us.